I want to thank the National Museum of the Pacific War and the Army Heritage and Education Center for the opportunity to speak with you. Today I'm discussing how the Army, in a very broad sense, treated casualties in the Pacific Theater with a focus on the Southwest Pacific area. The North and South Pacific areas will also briefly be discussed. The paper's title is taken from a quote by Lieutenant Colonel Simon Mormenhoven, who served as a surgeon with the Army's 32nd Infantry Division in the Pacific. The Army Heritage and Education Center is the largest repository for United States Army archival documents outside the National Archives and Records Administration. Holdings include more than 250,000 books, 1.7 million photographs, and 11 million manuscript pages. The collection is currently in the process of being digitized so that the AHEC's entire archival collection will be available to a global audience at its conclusion. I work as a contract research analyst in the Analysis and Research Team, or ART for short. ART provides historical research products, including studies to senior Army leaders. Our customers include the Army War College, Headquarters Department of the Army, and other major commands. This particular study began with a request from the Command Sergeant Major of the 18th Medical Command. This is the headquarters responsible for providing medical support to the United States Army Pacific and its higher headquarters, United States Pacific Command. One way that ART differentiates itself from other Army history writing organizations, such as the Center of Military History in Washington, is our focus. The studies that ART produces are generally shorter with a narrower focus, allowing us to expedite them to the customer. Most of the studies are concluded with lessons learned that are relevant to the current force. The presentation begins with a strategic overview to provide context for mid-1942. A review of contemporary Army medical doctrine based on existing field manuals provides insight on the casualty treatment and evacuation processes. 4 major campaigns serve as the basis for this case study. These are, in chronological order, Guadalcanal, Papua New Guinea, the Aleutians, and finally the Philippines Campaign. The study concludes with historical lessons learned that are relevant to the current force. I will show some of the related primary and secondary source materials I used that are available at the AHEC. By mid-1942, Imperial Japan's expansion had reached its limits. Japanese forces occupied the US territory of the Philippines and moved south into Dutch New Guinea, placing Japan within aircraft striking distance of Australia. In the South Pacific, Imperial Japanese troops landed on Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. In the Central Pacific, the Marianas and Marshall Island chains, fell under Japanese control. Tokyo had effectively established a perimeter defense using outlying island chains to protect its Asian prosperity sphere, shown here by the red dashed line. The Pacific Ocean area encompasses more than 68,634,000 square miles, making the theater the largest in terms of mileage of the war. The theater's vast size required extensive combat operations from the hot and humid and dense tropical jungles on islands in the Southwest, South, and Central Pacific regions to the barren, unpredictable, fog-shrouded, and mountainous terrain of the Aleutian Island chain in the North Pacific. The war effort in the Pacific required close cooperation between the United States Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and other allied units. The Joint Chiefs of Staff created 2 separate theater commands in April 1942 to plan and execute combat operations. General Douglas MacArthur served as commander of Southwest Pacific area. The Pacific Ocean Area Command, headed by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, was subdivided into 3 operational areas: the South Pacific area, the Central Pacific area, and the North Pacific area. The graphic on the left side of the slide shows the overall Allied strategy for the Pacific Theater. The broad Allied plan was to collapse Tokyo's sphere by attacking and capturing specific islands in each chain. After securing these objectives, land and sea invasion forces moved towards the next objective, each one closer to the Japanese home islands. This island hopping strategy concentrated combat power on key operational objectives and bypassed other occupied islands, leaving their garrisons to wither on the vine. Strategic Bomber Command squadrons then moved to secured islands and conducted a relentless bombing campaign against Japanese infrastructure, military targets, and major population centers. Simultaneously, Allied naval forces attacked the Imperial Japanese Navy and its merchant fleet, effectively severing its lines of communication and supply routes. All of these efforts created staging areas for the eventual invasion of Japan itself. The Allied strategy consisted of two primary axes of advance. The first, commanded by General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific, began with the liberation of Papua New Guinea and gradually progressed to attacking Japanese defenses in the Philippines. The drives in the Central Pacific began with attacks in the Gilbert Islands, eventually progressing to the Japanese island of Okinawa. Medical operations played an important role by treating casualties and returning as many men as possible to their units to maintain the initiative. Half of the campaign surveyed in the study, Papua and the Philippines, occurred in the Southwest Pacific. Guadalcanal was located in the South Pacific, and Attu occurred in the North Pacific. The graphic on the right side shows the extended distances in the Southwest Pacific area. To help illustrate the vast distances in the Southwest Pacific, I used the distance measurement feature on Google Maps. Starting from Darwin, Australia, it requires 1,989 miles to go north to Manila in the Philippines. From Darwin, traveling east takes 1,949 miles to reach Guadalcanal. Comparatively, going from New York City to, going from New York City to Salt Lake City, Utah, requires a traveler to go 1,953 miles. To put it in a more local context, the distance from Darwin to either Guadalcanal or Manila is almost as far as going from Fredericksburg, Texas to Las Vegas, Nevada, which is 2,020 miles. Army medical doctrine during World War II consisted of 5 echelons of treatment. These are illustrated using different colors. The first echelon is in red, the second in yellow, light blue boxes and arrows are used in the third, dark blue for the fourth, and green for the final echelon. The casualty treatment and evacuation process included a continual triage system, which determined if the patient was moved to the next echelon of care. The first level included treatment near or at the front lines by an aid man or a fellow soldier. At the battalion aid station, medical personnel focused on stopping bleeding, splinting fractures, sterilizing wounds, and if necessary, preparing the patient for movement to third tier treatment. Other second echelon functions included casualty collection points and clearing station operations. Third echelon functions, shown in light blue, included basic surgical procedures focused on stabilizing patients for movement to a fourth stage facility. The evacuation hospital was designed to prepare a severely injured or wounded soldier for movement to communication zone or zone of the interior treatment facilities. Zone of the interior refers to the United States. The convalescent hospital, part of the fourth echelon of care, was for those suffering from the effects of frontline service. Patients could shower, eat a hot meal, rest, and recover. Convalescent hospitals aided greatly in the recovery of personnel suffering from non-physical injuries, and physicians found that patients could be returned to service after only a couple weeks of convalescing. Station hospitals, located on a base or installation, provided medical care to personnel assigned to or transiting through the locale. Services provided included basic surgeries and dental treatment. General hospitals in the communication zone provided very specialized treatment and surgical procedures. For procedures that required more than 180 days of patient recovery, severely injured or wounded troops went to a fifth level of facility, a general hospital in the zone of the interior, shown here in green. Those who recovered at a stateside general hospital were sent to a convalescent hospital for reintegration back into theater and onward movement to their unit. Medical doctrine developers understood, as physicians do today, the importance of timely medical treatment, and by 1944 incorporated a field hospital that provided all of the same services as a station hospital, the only difference being that it was transportable. The field hospital provided another option for the staff at the clearing station to send patients to for increased levels of care. From the field hospital, patients were moved to station hospitals or convalescent hospitals for additional treatment. The timeliness of treatment became an increase for concern during the early campaigns on Guadalcanal and New Guinea. Teams of stretcher bearers had to create paths through dense vegetation, carry casualties through mudslides, across swollen creeks and streams, under continual downpours, and through dense swarms of insects. Colonel, later Brigadier General Percy Carroll, whose picture is shown here, served as General MacArthur's chief medical officer until 1943 and developed a concept designed to bring the operating room as close to the front lines as possible. He gathered a group of medical officers and inquired about the minimal amount of surgical instruments and medical supplies required to operate. This became the basis for the portable surgical hospital. The idea was that the surgical staff, including physicians and orderlies, carried everything required to perform surgery into the field on their backs. General Carroll established an age limit of 32 for participants to help ensure that they were capable of carrying out this mission. Staff of portable surgical hospitals were susceptible to enemy artillery and mortar fire, depending on the location of the hospital. It became part of Army doctrine by 1944, although it was well in use before that. These facilities became another important option for clearing station patients. After being stabilized at a portable surgical hospital, patients could be moved to field, station, or evacuation hospitals. This diagram leads to one of the most important lessons learned in this study: the requirement for competent, trained medical personnel at all levels of care. The medical transportation system also required staff and physicians to accompany patients as they traveled throughout both the Pacific and the United States to receive the appropriate level of care. In August 1942, the United States attempted its first ground offensive against the Japanese garrison occupying Guadalcanal and the Solomons. The island contained an airfield critical for resupplying units and evacuated wounded and injured. The base could also be used to launch airstrikes and as a staging base for amphibious assault against the Japanese airbase on Rabaul. The campaign's tactics foreshadowed subsequent U.S. ground operations in the Pacific. Intense combat against the fatalistic and determined opponent fought in a primitive and unforgiving environment. Operations on the island also tested the casualty evacuation process. The lack of road networks and battle fought in dense jungle areas required casualties to be moved to battalion aid stations using stretcher teams. The undulating terrain, swollen streams and creeks, and high temperatures exhausted stretcher bearers. Guadalcanal was America's first offensive operation and taught inexperienced combat troops about the realities of battling a fanatical enemy in a rugged tropical environment. U.S. forces sustained more than 4,800 enemy-induced casualties during the campaign. Tropical disease also affected American combat power during the campaign. The chart on the right shows the malaria infection rates during Guadalcanal. The rates began falling after November 1942 with the arrival of malaria control teams, medical labs, and a robust medical structure. Battle stress, a neuropsychological condition, now diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, also impacted troops on Guadalcanal. Physicians found that one of the best remedies for the condition was temporary removal from frontline duty. Severely impacted men were evacuated to convalescent hospitals in the communication zone or zone of the interior for more intensive recuperation. The men established a relay system to efficiently move troops from collection points. Injured or wounded troops could be moved to airfields using jeeps specially modified to carry litters. From there, injured personnel could be flown southward to general, station, and convalescent hospitals on New Caledonia, Fiji, or in New Zealand. Air transport became the preferred means of evacuating casualties. Treatment aboard ship required loading casualties onto a designated lighterage vessel, moved across the open ocean, and transferred onto a designated troop transport for further treatment. The aircraft proved more reliable than offshore vessels, since the supporting United States Navy fleet was temporarily ordered to withdraw twice during the campaign due to enemy activity. Planes were also a more stable platform than amphibious vessels, which battled their way through currents and waves to offshore ships. The Guadalcanal campaign served as a lethal learning environment. In addition to the physical wounds of battle, soldiers and Marines struggled with malaria and other tropical diseases. Army medical personnel anticipated gunshot, stab, and fragmentation wounds, but were not initially prepared for combating tropical disease or the psychological trauma of battle. Lessons learned as a result of these experiences included specialized units for malaria control and widespread distribution of preventive medicine. As a result, each division medical staff was authorized to license psychiatrists to manage treatment programs for soldiers suffering from neuropsychological disorders. The campaign tested the medical evacuation process. Transport aircraft, after local air superiority was achieved, proved to be the most efficient way to transport troops to appropriate treatment facilities in the communication zone. Parasite eradication, including mosquitoes, preventive medicine, psychological care, and multimodal evacuation means became commonplace in subsequent Pacific campaigns. New Guinea's equatorial location meant constant heavy rains that created stagnant pools of water, flooded swamps, and allowed parasite populations, including mosquitoes, to thrive. At sea level, a thick jungle covered the primitive island with only unimproved trails leading inland. In the center of the island, in the center of Papua, elevation increased and temperatures decreased due to the Owen-Stanley mountain range, shown here in dark gray. The range's highest peak is 13,000 feet above sea level. In late September 1942, the Japanese, after advancing on Port Moresby and being repulsed by the Australians, retreated to the seaside villages of Buna and Gona. The Japanese commander now focused on improving his defensive positions. General MacArthur viewed this as an opportunity to take the offensive. Allied combat forces included the experienced 7th Australian Division and the fresh United States 32nd and 41st Infantry Divisions. 2 regimental combat teams, consisting of an infantry regiment with medical and engineer units attached of the 32nd Infantry Division, were initially sent from Port Moresby to help reinforce the Australian defense. After the Japanese retreat, General MacArthur and his staff created a 2-pronged offensive. The Australians, shown using the green arrows, would continue to fight up the Kokoda Trail, pushing Japanese defenders towards their bases near the northern beaches. In the process, veteran troops of the 7th Division would secure the airfield near Kokoda. A reinforced infantry battalion from the 32nd, 2nd Battalion, 126th Infantry Regiment would depart from the town of Kappa Kappa, located more than 30 miles south of Port Moresby, and advance on a parallel axis south of the Kokoda Trail towards the village of Jare. American ground movements are shown in blue and with blue solid lines, and air movements are shown with dashed lines. General MacArthur feared that the dense jungle would impede the advance of large units and settled instead on sending the reinforced battalion. The remaining elements of the division would be airlifted to Kokoda. Another regimental combat team was moved up the coast via watercraft from Milne Bay and airlifted in to prepare for assaulting Buna. The trek of the Ghost Battalion through the Kappa Kappa Jare Trail tested the physical and psychological endurance of the soldiers. Constant rain soaked uniforms and equipment, flooded leach-filled rivers and streams, and prevented the building of cooking fires, forcing soldiers to eat basic rations, including rice and bully beef uncooked. Environmental conditions and mishandling by hungry troops caused the beef to spoil quickly, and its consumption resulted in a severe dysentery outbreak in the command. The lack of personal hygiene, continual movement, and light uniforms led to a plague of lice, scrub typhus, and severe skin rashes. Heavy rains facilitated the growth of the mosquito population, resulting in widespread transmission of malaria. Medical officers remained at the rear of the formation to aid those slowed by injury. Only the prospect of being isolated and captured prevented widespread straggling. The 2nd Battalion, 126th Infantry began their advance on October 6th and reached Jare by the 28th, covering a distance of more than 55 arduous miles in 23 days. After arriving at their destination, the battalion rested briefly before moving forward for the assault on Buna. The Americans and Australians were in position by early November and launched their attacks on the 16th. The Japanese had very skillfully built their defenses around the natural topography of the area. Dry trails that crossed rain-swollen swamps became kill zones. Bunkers were built using heavy logs and were so well camouflaged that some were not visible until attackers were 20 feet away. By the end of November, the tenacious Japanese defense and strained supply lines had stalled efforts to capture Gona and Buna. Thwarted and frustrated, General MacArthur ordered his corps commander, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, to relieve the 32nd Infantry Division commander, Major General Harding, on December 2nd. New offensive operations began on December 5th. The Australians broke through and captured Dona on the 9th. More American reinforcements arrived. And with Japanese air support lessening, supply craft were able to make their way up from Milne Bay. Troops of the 32nd Infantry Division finally reached Buna by December 14th. 2 weeks later, Buna was cleared, and by January 3rd, 1943, the remaining Japanese defenders had been flushed out or killed. During the campaign, disease and environmental conditions proved more debilitating than Japanese bayonets and bullets. This diagram illustrates the effects of disease. Data on admissions to hospitals established in Port Moresby shows that of the more than 26,000 troops that were admitted, only 16% went for wounds or injuries. The remaining were treated for various diseases. Tropical disease rates were very similar to those recorded on Guadalcanal. Quinine, an anti-malaria antidote, was not available in mass quantities, and atabrine was still being tested when the campaign started. Ill-trained and ill-prepared, many troops discarded items such as mosquito nets, extra underwear, and other critical items deemed excess to lighten their packs. The battles fought to eradicate Japanese defenses at Buna helped to shape Army medical care and evacuation processes. Medical facilities at Port Moresby relied on aircraft for patient transport, while Milne Bay hospitals relied on local littoral craft to transport casualties, although both required local air superiority to do so safely. Tactical casualty movements were more precarious and resembled those of Guadalcanal, requiring physical manpower to move patients between aid stations, collection, and clearing points. Portable surgical hospitals were also employed for immediate treatment, and patients could also be moved to an airfield for evacuation. In June 1943, General MacArthur launched Operation Cartwheel, a series of amphibious operations designed to drive Japanese defenders from northern New Guinea and surrounding islands. Cartwheel became a protracted operation, and combat operations continued until the last Japanese strongholds were captured in September. The Japanese seizure of Attu and Kiska was part of a larger campaign to seize Midway Island. Tokyo hoped to divert American ships and aircraft away from their main effort against Midway. Imperial forces landed on Kiska and Attu on June 6th and 7th, 1942. Kiska was the more important location due to its size and airfield. The Imperial High Command viewed this as a defensive measure and not as a stepping stone for future offensive action. The troops of the 7th Infantry Division were training for a North African mission in the Mojave Desert when they were rerouted to the Pacific Theater. The surprise Japanese attacks and occupations of Kiska and Attu forced the remissioning of the 7th Infantry Division. The division was relocated to Fort Ord and began their amphibious training in Monterey Bay with Marine Corps advisors. The training regiment focused on ship-to-shore operations, but did not replicate the Aleutians' environmental conditions. Senior officers, including the division commander, Major General Albert E. Brown, failed to ensure that the invasion force was properly equipped. He declined to replace issue leather boots and field jackets with waterproof shoe packs and hooded parkas. The geographic location of the islands created unique and unpredictable weather conditions. The area was a collision point between Arctic cold air masses from the north and warmer air currents from the south. This merger created heavy fog, moisture, and precipitation. The dense mist masked both invaders and defenders and impaired air support. As the Arctic tundra thawed, it created a marsh-like bog that made movement by foot difficult and transportation using vehicles nearly impossible without the construction of temporary roadways. Both volcanic islands contain mountainous terrain capped with snow. The main Japanese defense on Attu centered around Chicago Harbor. The graphic on the left-hand side shows the American concept of operation and landings. The 7th Infantry Division's main effort began with a landing at Massacre Bay and advance up Massacre Valley. Two smaller forces landing at the northern beaches served as shaping operations. Both pincers would then converge on the Japanese defenses near Chicago. Although the Japanese did not contest the landing, the Imperial Japanese Army commander placed machine gun positions, snipers, and fighting positions along the bridge lines, shown here in red. This forced American units to clamber up steep elevations and through deep snow to destroy enemy positions. The right-hand graphic illustrates the closing phases of the invasion. By May 28th, more than 2 weeks after the initial landing, Americans pressed the Japanese into a perimeter near the harbor. The Japanese commander ordered the remaining defenders to launch an all-out assault during the early morning hours of May 29th. The Imperial attack broke through the US front lines and into rear areas, including field hospitals. Unprepared physicians and staff suffered sword and bayonet wounds, in addition to gunshots. Every Japanese attacker was killed or seriously wounded. 19 medical personnel were killed and another 29 were wounded during the futile attack. The lessons learned on Attu were incorporated into the training for the invasion of Kiska. Soldiers from the 7th Infantry Division trained alongside a Canadian brigade on the nearby island of Adak to acclimatize men with the terrain and the environment. These lessons also included a sizable invasion force numbering more than 34,000 men, armed and properly equipped, including parkas and Arctic footwear for the beach assault. The troops splashed ashore on August 15, 1943, unopposed. The veterans of Attu cautiously advanced inland, familiar with the Japanese tactic of withdrawing inland and utilizing more defensible terrain. The following day, the Canadian brigade landed and met no resistance. As the days progressed, it became more apparent that the Japanese had evacuated the island. After the fall of Attu, Tokyo recognized the futility of occupying Kiska and ordered the evacuation of troops at the end of July. The Aleutian Campaign was a microcosm of United States Army operations in the Pacific Theater during World War II. 7th Infantry Division was unprepared and ill-equipped for the hardships they faced on Attu. Disease and other non-battle injuries, including trench foot, incapacitated more troops than the enemy. Attu's location, more than 830 miles from medical facilities at Dutch Harbor, required offshore naval support to provide specialized medical treatment. Of the more than 3,700 American casualties sustained on Attu, 55% were not directly affected by Japanese bullets, bayonets, or shells. The brutal month-long operation resulted in more than 1,697 battlefield casualties for American units, while another 2,100 sustained non-battle injuries, compared with the 2,351 Japanese defenders killed, 98% of the garrison on Attu. These casualty figures translate roughly into a ratio of 1 American to 0.062 Japanese casualties, respectively. This proportion would not be matched until the Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945. The campaign for the Philippines required sequenced island assaults on 3 large land masses, beginning with Leyte in October, in the center of the island chain, followed by Luzon in January, and an invasion of Mindanao and other islands in the south the following March. The size of the islands required multiple divisions organized into 2 field armies and 5 corps, shown here. The large island masses required divisions to maneuver and also necessitated the combination of doctrinal medical treatment and evacuation processes, and newer innovations such as the portable surgical hospital. These factors made the campaign uniquely different from the previous ones. By the time of Leyte, costly lessons were deeply ingrained in Army leadership. At the tactical level, troops had their uniforms sprayed with anti-insect chemicals to guard against scrub typhus carrying lice, and men consumed approved dosages of atabrine prior to landing to protect against mosquitoes and malaria. As the advanced inland progressed, portable surgical hospitals went into operation, providing immediate surgery for life-saving and stabilization purposes. From there, ambulances and jeeps moved casualties to field or evacuation hospitals located near recaptured airfields. The 4-engine C-54 transport aircraft, first deployed to the Pacific in November 1944 in limited numbers, provided the theater with the capability to move patients back to the zone of the interior. The plane's range, 4,000 miles, permitted transportation from Guam to Hawaii, 3,820 miles away, although transport ships still remain the primary means for moving casualties back to the zone of the interior. By the time of the Luzon invasion in January 1945, Army medical support evacuation procedures learned during the Guadalcanal campaign became standard. This chart on the left-hand side illustrates the robust medical support provided to the two corps responsible for the initial invasion. The Army also developed procedures for medical support during beach landings, shown here on the right side. Organic medical personnel accompanied their assault force units in the first wave. The aid men provided immediate care and stabilized wounded or injured troops. Successive units landed with assigned medical personnel. After the first 4 waves had landed and attacked enemy positions, medics established battalion aid stations and began work on providing advanced treatment. 2 to 3 waves following the establishment of the aid station, collecting platoons arrived ashore to establish transit points to triage patients and move severely injured men from the beach to waiting lighterage vessels for movement out to fleet-based treatment facilities. On Luzon, Japanese commanders set up defenses inland and used the mountains and surrounding hills surrounding the central plains to establish defensive lines. Assaults against fortified positions on elevated and steep terrain impaired the casualty evacuation process. Jeeps and ambulances provided a crude, lengthy, and uncomfortable ride for evacuees being moved down the mountain and hill passes to evacuation or field hospitals at lower elevations. Improvisation came to the fore, and small aerial reconnaissance aircraft, such as the L-5 Sentinel, were temporarily modified to accommodate stretchers or ambulatory personnel. Although limited in carry capacity and range, L-5s and other small planes could quickly move severely injured personnel from aid stations and collection points located at high elevations directly to hospitals and treatment facilities at nearby airfields. Although expanded treatment facilities on the ground on Luzon aided the medical care process, aeromedical evacuation remained a critical capability. This is illustrated by the graphic on the right-hand side. Disease, primarily malaria, remained a self-inflicted problem. Atabrine, by late 1944, was being produced and issued in mass quantities. Production of the drug exceeded 625 million tablets in the fourth quarter of 1944. In spite of this abundance, troops involved in the Luzon campaign continued to fall victim to malaria. Some units faced overextended supply lines, but others preferred a temporary bout with malaria and the accompanying movement back to a rear area facility for recuperation to remaining at the front lines and battling the Japanese. General MacArthur's final major objective in the Philippines following the recapturing of Leyte and Luzon was securing Mindanao, located south of Leyte. The U.S. 8th Army received the mission of liberating the island. From April until June 1945, U.S. divisions fought their way through Mindanao. The Japanese garrison had been stripped to bolster defensive positions in Leyte and Luzon. Japanese ground units consolidated their forces in the center of the island and put up a determined struggle using a labyrinth of bunkers and emplacements interconnected with tunnels. American troops engaged in heavy combat in eastern Mindanao, and on June 30th, Lieutenant General Eichelberger declared the operation complete. The Mindanao campaign, like the preceding island battles, came at a high cost that included 820 killed and 2,880 wounded. So I'm going to cover now some of the lessons learned that we provided to the Sergeant Major of the 18th Medical Command. The U.S. force buildup in Australia in early 1942 focused on moving combat troops at the expense of service troops, including physicians, into the Southwest Pacific area. Soldiers from divisions far outnumbered providers and their staffs. This included a lack of specialized teams to contain or destroy the parasite populations responsible for the widespread outbreak of disease during the campaigns on Guadalcanal, Papua. In addition to containing a wide range of specialties, the Medical Corps had to provide doctors, nurses, and staff to support general, station, field, and convalescent hospitals, plus other medical treatment facilities. Medical Corps personnel staffed medical battalions at the division level and were required to accompany and monitor evacuated troops in transport both within theater and to the zone of the interior. Additional physicians were required to replace those killed, wounded, or injured during service near the front lines. In future operations, medical personnel, including specialized teams, should deploy sufficient strength to provide immediate and competent treatment for the troop population, both in the combat zone and the communication zone. The Pacific operating environment, including islands and atolls, separated by hundreds of miles of ocean, make joint operations a necessity. Medical evacuation in the Central Pacific rested almost entirely on naval support. The size of the atolls and islands precluded the establishment of onshore treatment facilities until after the neutralization of Japanese defenses. The United States Air Force would provide the intra-theater airlift capability provided by the Army Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, although currently at a much reduced rate. An extended conflict in the Pacific would require significant expansion of the current air transport fleet. A future regional conflict in the Pacific necessitates the creation of an in-theater comprehensive readiness program, training programs in jungle operations, self-care, theater-provided equipment such as mosquito nets and insect repellent, disease prevention, and other topics related to combat in the tropics, ensures that personnel receive an extensive preparation program unavailable during the early stages of the Pacific Campaign in 1942. Use and ingestion of approved anti-disease medications, could help protect individuals against local maladies and prevent the outbreaks of epidemics in units. Environmental familiarization could be accomplished by practicing warfighting tasks to condition troops assigned in equatorial regions. Trained, properly medicated, and acclimated troops would significantly reduce the number of troops requiring evacuation during combat operations. One of the major findings of the study is that medical care, like tactics or operations, is an evolutionary process created by shifting environmental variables and changing battlefield conditions and requirements. The soldiers who stepped ashore on Leyte in 1944 were much better prepared and equipped than their predecessors from the 2nd Battalion, 126th Infantry Regiment, who trekked from Kappa Kappa to Jare in October 1942. C-54 transports made direct flights from Guam to Hawaii, helping to expedite those requiring immediate 5th echelon treatment in the United States. Finally, one point I emphasize to our customer is that we cannot compartmentalize these lessons as events that occurred more than 75 years ago and have no bearing on future operations. Medical science has improved along with new technologies, but the disease, heavy precipitation, mud flooding, and other environmental conditions remain the same. And the best way to prepare soldiers for it is through tough, realistic hands-on training under these conditions. As medical advancements have continued and advanced over the years, so has the lethality and destructiveness of weapon systems and platforms. All of these factors should be taken into consideration as the Army prepares for the next conflict. So this slide shows the range of primary and secondary source materials that I use for this study, and that are available at the Army Heritage and Education Center. On the far left side of the slide is probably the best secondary source I used in this study. It's titled "The Medical Service in the War Against Japan" by Mary Ellen Condon and Albert E. Cowdery. This is published by the Center of Military History and is available for download on their website. The other materials shown are from the Robert Ferguson collection and are related to the Aleutian Campaign. Mr. Ferguson served as the G2 or intelligence officer for the 7th Infantry Division during the campaign. In the middle background is a hand-drawn Japanese map of defensive positions in Massacre Valley, the division's primary avenue of advance. In the foreground is a handwritten note from Mr. Ferguson to General Brown, who was relieved as division commander during the campaign. On the far right document is an after-action report on Attu from the Alaska Defense Command that was published on June 3rd, 1943. So these next two documents are also from the Robert Ferguson collection. On the left is a by-name interrogation list of the 26 out of the 29 Japanese prisoners captured on Attu. The right-hand side shows a typed interrogation report, which is available for each of the prisoners on the list on the left-hand side. So for more information on the Army Heritage and Education Center activities and resources, including some of our case studies, please use the top web link. If there's a specific conflict, topic, or senior leader you're interested in researching, please use the Lib Answers web link to find out what resources are available. And finally, if you would like to visit the facility and conduct research on site, please use the WebCal web link at the bottom of the page to reserve a desk in our reading room. Thanks again to both to the National Museum of the Pacific War and the Army Heritage and Education Center for the opportunity to present today.
So we have a question here for you, Shane. When will the digitization of the holdings be completed at the American Heritage and Education Center?
So right now, the current state is they're in the midst of the second year of a 5-year contract to do that. So it's a pretty extensive process. So they actually have a team on site at the AHEC that's actually organizing the collections. The collections are shipped out to another location where they're scanned and digitized. Then the collections are sent back and then they're rehoused. So it's probably another at least 3 years before the entire collection is available online according to current timelines.
Okay. Would troops diagnosed with combat fatigue and removed to hospitals be reevaluated to return, or would they eventually just sent home?
That all depended on the situation. So at the convalescent hospitals, they would have psychiatrists there that the troops would talk to, and the psychiatrists would make a determination on if the soldiers could return to frontline duty or if they required further evacuation.
When was malaria treatment made available to the soldiers in Guadalcanal? And then did certain people have more priority in getting treatment than others?
The anti-malaria treatment started, I think, towards the end of the Guadalcanal campaign. I don't know about the order of precedence for receiving the medication specifically.
Okay. How does diversified, oh my gosh, hold on, sorry. What were the most significant points and the evolution of the Army medical evacuation schematic you showed? For instance, World War II to Korea to Vietnam, or another kind of war?
I really didn't focus too much on how the medical process developed after World War II and how it was related to Korea. So, I think, as the war, part of the problem is that, after the Korean War, there was such a large force drawdown. So the Army lost a lot of its capabilities, including medical capabilities. So I really haven't delved into how the Army rebuilt those capabilities during the Korean War or the medical capabilities they used during Vietnam.
Okay. Thank you again, Shane. I know there's quite a snowstorm happening on the East Coast, so I want to make sure that you stay safe and you get to shoveling. So again, thank you, Shane, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We did record this session, so we should have it up on our website in the new year. So keep a lookout for that. And please send any other questions to us at education@nimmitzfoundation.org. And again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.